It's Monday, and that means it's time to talk about the box office with Mr. Dan Murrell. I'm Roth Cornet, and we have to talk about Crazy Rich Asians and the chart that will accompany that impressive open.
So many charts. There was a lot of people pulling for Crazy Rich Asians this weekend, including us. It had a limit of not a limit, but a basis of expectation about where people thought it was going to open. It actually performed at the very upper end of that, exceeding some people's expectations. Was the #1 movie this weekend. Some had thought maybe the Meg would be challenging it, but Crazy Rich Asians actually managed to pull ahead. $26.5 million. That's actually even higher than the estimate yesterday. It's a win-win for Warner Brothers because those are both their movies. So they were really competing against themselves. But in a much broader sense, that's great news for Crazy Rich Asians. Better news when you realize that it opened last Wednesday. It's actually made $35 million since it opened last Wednesday. That's off a $30 million budget. It's a very modest budget, although I would not be shocked to hear that Warner Brothers had spent significantly more than that on the marketing. They really marketed this movie. But again, as we were talking about last week with the Meg, the marketing seems to have had an impact. It looks like the marketing targeted the right markets. Looking at the information as far as attendance, it hit the older female demographic, which is really where they were going more broadly as far as for the romantic comedy genre.
Sure.
But it also hit they were really trying to reach the Asian and Asian American demographic. And if you look at the attendance, almost 40% of the viewing audience this past weekend for Crazy Rich Asians were Asian and Asian Americans. That means the marketing was targeted really well. It was a product that people were very excited about. It had a very strong cinema score. And again, coming off a $35 million opening over 5 days, looking toward the future, you're in August. This is a movie that could have legs, that could perform really well in the weeks to come, especially off that kind of word of mouth.
Well, we're going to be talking about the legs of the Meg and Crazy Rich Asians as we get into the summer movie report. But to your point, Dan, and we talked about this a little bit last week as well, Warner Brothers had a restructuring in their marketing department a little bit earlier this year. And these are two big successes on the heels of that. So that's got to feel really good for those folks in that department. And it stands now. We're going to have a different opinion about where it stands in terms of the top comedy openers this year.
That's true. There has been a little back and forth. I saw a lot of reporting saying that it was the top comedy opener of the year. And I think that depends on if you're talking pure comedy as far as it's just a straight comedy, then yes. However, for my charting purposes, a lot of times I get a little subjective. I put it behind Deadpool 2 only because looking at the movies, I felt that Deadpool 2 was first and foremost
a comedy. I agree.
However, if you wanted to contest that Deadpool 2 shouldn't be there, I would certainly hear that protest. I myself was debating it. But yeah, it was, other than Deadpool 2, it topped all of the other comedy opening weekends for the year. $6 million higher than Blockers, Life of the Party, Game Night. Comedy has had a very touch and go. It's had a bit of a resurgence this year, but the last few years have been tough for especially original live action comedies. Not original in the sense of, not based on anything, but original in the sense of not part of a franchise, not a sequel. And Crazy Rich Asians, again, setting the mark for, just the straight up studio comedy. If you, kind of blow past Deadpool, which some people would say is a hybrid, I understand that reasoning. But again, showing that it sort of transcended how that genre has been doing on its own with the opening weekend.
To be fair, on the hybrid question, a romantic comedy is already a hybrid in and of itself.
This is true.
We've seen the superhero and comic book genre evolve over the last number of years, 10 plus years. And I think it's fair to say that there are hybrids now. So how that evolves in the future, we shall see. Ant-Man is one that I would say is a comedy first.
Is it a superhero film first or is it a comedy first? Exactly.
Yeah, we can make that argument.
It's the lines are sort of blurring. I think the one thing that hasn't been blurring is it's another example looking at sort of what people have been saying all along as far as the kinds of movies that are being made is that if you greenlight projects that are from diverse filmmakers that have diverse subject matters, but that are effectively produced and effectively marketed and given the resources to reach a broad audience and to market to audiences that will really latch onto the film and appreciate the fact that they're telling those kinds of stories. it can be a win-win-win all around, because Crazy Rich Asians, and we're not even talking about the global market, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is already set up to be a real financial success for the studio. And looking at, the producers of the film, there was a lot in the press last week before it opened. They had a deal on the table from Netflix to buy Crazy Rich Asians, and I believe it was greenlit with 2 sequels greenlit, Go Pictures, that they turned down, saying, we really want to put this out in theaters. We really want this to stand theatrically, and it looks like that is a risk, that is a gamble, and it looks like it's a gamble that's paid off.
So it's a really, really important lesson, I think, for Hollywood to continue to learn over the last 2 years. There are a number of films that have taught this lesson, but here we go. I think it's now undeniable in terms of diversity. But what's been interesting, I've been doing a lot of reading in terms of the development of the project, and certain iterations along the development, people were pushing for maybe Rachel could be Caucasian,
right?
And things along of this nature.
Let's put a movie star.
Let's put a movie star in it. All these other things, and I think that what we see here is so important in terms of like, no, let's not do that. Let's actually tell the story, and people will come see it because there is an appetite for romantic comedies. This is a genre that is in and of itself under. We don't see much of that, and there is an appetite for diverse stories that give us a little different look at the world. So good news, The Little Shark That Could, and the latest collaboration between Peter Berg and Mark Wahlberg and Mile 22, they're in there as well. They're in the mix.
Yeah, the Meg dropped 53% in week 2. That's a respectable number for a blockbuster. It's not an amazing hold, but it's not a bad drop either. Like 50 to 60%, that's right in the range. We'll continue to see how it does in the month of August. One thing that could perhaps have suffered from the Meg not having a big drop is Mile 22. That opened in a disappointing 3rd place when you look at the budget, what it was produced for. And this is something that kind of surprised me. We talked a couple weeks ago about Mark Wahlberg and Peter Berg, how often they've collaborated. This is their 4th collaboration. Looking at the box office returns for their films, Lone Survivor, which I believe was their first collaboration, was a huge financial success. But Deepwater Horizon and Patriots Day both were disappointments at the box office financially, not just domestically, but worldwide. When you look at what they cost, Deepwater Horizon particularly was a massively expensive movie, over $100 million. Worldwide, barely made its budget back, but as we've talked about on the show, you need to do so much more than that in order to get into the black. And then Patriots Day was also a film that just barely made back its production budget worldwide. So this looks like another collaboration. They both seem to be very artistically engaged with collaborating with each other. But Mile 22 is going to have to look at international money again to see if it can do better at the box office. The domestic debut was not good. It does open in a number of markets next week, including Indonesia, which is big for this film because Iko Uwais, who I believe was the best part of this movie, and he brought this movie to life, and they largely squandered him, I thought, in this film. He was by far the standout. His native Indonesia is where one of the markets where the film opens next week, so perhaps it can tap into some markets leveraging on his fame and his personality. But as far as domestically... And
then they'll just want to go see his other films.
Exactly. Well, that was my advice, was that if you want to see Mile 22, just watch The Raid and The Raid 2. And you'll see the best parts of this movie, and by the way, 2 awesome movies.
You should watch The Raid and The Raid 2 in any case. So we're going to circle back to The Raid and The Raid 2 and sort of why we haven't seen a breakout in that director, but that's another discussion that I have a lot of questions about.
It's a whole other issue.
That's a whole other episode. We'll do that on SGU maybe.
Yep.
Mission Impossible.
Mission
hangs
Impossible,
in, but cedes a little ground.
It's hanging in there. It's at number 4. It's still holding well, but I was looking at the daily grosses. It's still on track to become the highest grossing Mission Impossible film domestically. However, looking at how it's grossing day to day, it's losing a little bit of ground. At first, we were talking about how Mission Impossible 2 is tracking ahead of it. Now it's losing a little bit of ground to Ghost Protocol. If you look at the daily the daily numbers, Ghost Protocol was outgrossing it by some substantial amounts when you look at the weekend numbers, partly because it was a year-end release, so the schedule's a little bit different. But it's losing a little bit of ground. It's something to keep an eye on. If Ghost Protocol's daily grosses continue to be higher than what Fallout is making, you could see it begin to lose even more ground to Ghost Protocol as far as the highest grossing domestic Mission Impossible movie. But that's just something to keep an eye on. Right now, it's still on track to become the highest grossing domestic one, but something to keep an eye on.
Alpha, which I'd been hearing a lot about, this is a movie that went through a lot of different iterations behind the scenes.
Yeah.
But you have made me, frankly, very curious and enthused to go see it.
Alpha was a movie that I actually did not have much interest in, and I ran into a fellow critic and a friend of ours, William Bibbiani, at a screening last week, and he told me that it looked incredible. And so I ended up going to see it. It was one of the few movies I actually shelled out and went to see the IMAX 3D. I actually didn't have to shell out because I got the AMC thing, which is great. If you want to do the 3D, you don't have to pay extra. And I thought it was a stunningly beautiful film. One of the best uses of the 3D format. It was specially formulated for that format, and I thought that there's some really effective visual moments. It's from Albert Hughes, who known largely for directing with his brother, the Hughes brothers, but the first movie he's done in quite a long time, and I was a little disappointed that it opened so low, because I do think it is a film that deserves more attention than it got this weekend. It begins a worldwide rollout this week, so maybe it'll strike a chord elsewhere, but Alpha is one that I would say, if you have a free weekend or a free weekday, if you don't mind paying the extra for the 3D, IMAX 3D, I would recommend it. I thought it was a beautiful, absolutely visually stunning movie, and the story, it's kind of a wilderness survival story. It's nothing that hasn't been told before, but I think that the craft of it is worth going to see, and I really enjoyed the experience of watching it.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm now going to check it out, and you have made me curious. It's going to be an interesting top per screen conversation this week, because we have both Glenn Close and the wife taking the prize, and then we have a tale of how to bury a movie in 3 steps with Kevin Spacey. Let's dig in.
Well, let's start with the good, which is the top per screen winner was The Wife, starring Glenn Close and Jonathan Pryce. The per screen winner, $27,000 on 4 screens. This is based on a novel by Meg Wolitzer. The script was written by Jane Anderson. She won an Emmy for writing the HBO miniseries, I think it was HBO Olive Kitteridge or Showtime.
Yeah, HBO.
And also she wrote an episode of Mad Men, directed by a Swedish director named Bjorn Rung. And I caught it this weekend, and I thought that, there was some rumors. This actually premiered at the Toronto Film Festival, which is about to happen now, last year. And so it's almost a year since it's hit the festival circuit. There was some discussion that perhaps this was held back a year to give Glenn Close a better shot at awards consideration. I think this is a film that she should be considered. She gives, I think, a great understated performance. The movie it's the kind of movie that I like, the kind of movie that I would recommend at the end of the year, and people say, why don't you recommend something somebody's actually seen? Because it's not going to be a breakout mainstream hit, but I think the performances are what really give this movie its edge. And it's about, she's the wife of a Nobel Prize winning author, and then as they go to Stockholm to accept the award, you learn more about the husband, played by Jonathan Pryce. You learn more about Glenn Close, more about their relationship, and it sort of unfolds in a way that you revisit moments from earlier in the film, which I think is what makes her performance so impressive, is she plays moments early in the film having knowledge that the audience does not know, that when you go back and look back on them, you realize there's much more depth there than you had originally even thought that there was. So I recommend this movie a lot, particularly if you like very intimate kind of character based dramas. So that was the number one contender at the per screen, and we'll see how it does with the awards.
Well, I mean, in terms of the movies that I recommend at the end of the year as well, they're largely movies that I think are the best movies, but they're also movies that I hope that if you haven't seen them, then that's an opportunity to get a recommendation to see something that you might have otherwise missed in theaters because it wasn't available or you weren't able to see it at the time, that is now available on VOD. And we had a different conversation, which we'll circle back to, I think, in another video, about movies that are subtle, and how those can largely be passed over in the conversation around awards. We were referring to Cameron Post. We'll talk about that in another video. Let's talk about Kevin Spacey.
Speaking of VOD,
yeah,
this is a movie that's been available on VOD for a few weeks now. And as you mentioned, this is sort of how to bury a movie in 3 easy steps. My guess would be this is a movie called Billionaire Boys Club. It was actually made for $15 million, but it's so obscure they didn't even have an English language poster. Mm-hmm. That's the best poster I could find, and it's not, they didn't even market it really in the United States. $15 million budget. It stars Ansel Elgort and Taron Egerton.
So it's got a great cast.
It's got 2 very compelling young lead actors. However, it has a supporting role. This was filmed before the scandal from Kevin Spacey. So for obvious reasons related to what happened at the end of last year, theatrical release was probably not going to be a possibility for them. This was put out on VOD a few weeks ago. This weekend, it was launched theatrically in 11 theaters. I'm guessing this was a contractual obligation to release it theatrically. Not in New York, not in Los Angeles, which is usually where you're going to put something out. It was in San Francisco, Phoenix, Detroit, Sarasota, the Hartford, New Haven area, from what I'm told. Not the 2, lead markets. So the goal here was not to have it build an audience.
Probably the most hostile markets to it in an interesting way, yeah.
It grossed $618 total, which breaks out to $56 per theater, which when you look at the average ticket price, averages about 6 people per theater this weekend went to see this movie.
That is fascinating. Wasn't that, correct me if I'm wrong, Billionaire Boys Club, was that a book? Was it based on a book?
It was based on, I'd have to go back and check. Actually, it's one of the things that I was looking at the distributors and everything. Yeah. I know that it was based on, I'm not sure if it was a book or a miniseries, but it was based on other source material. Like I mentioned, $15 million to produce. It's been a tough year. It was distributed by Vertical Entertainment, whose previous most notable feature was Gotti, as far as what it distributed. And it was actually, the production company behind it was Armory Films, who was behind Mudbound. Yeah. And I think that's the real, when you talk about the ripple effect of a scandal, particularly what happened with Kevin Spacey, Armory Films is not Paramount, is not Universal. This is not a huge studio that you can just take a $15 million write-off and put it on the books. This is a smaller company.
They need the win. They
need the win. Like I said, Mudbound was a great artistic achievement and a great one of those things that you build a company on. But a Netflix went to Netflix for most of its distribution, had a limited theatrical run, but probably not a huge grosser. And so, this is the kind of thing, the sort of collateral damage that you see when you have a film starring, a figure like Kevin Spacey, where it was just sort of tanked by the things that came out about him last year. So, a downside for them, the movie's gonna fade away. It's one of those things that would be interesting if things were different, if they had picked a different supporting star. Who knows what this movie would have done? This could have been one of the small buzzy movies that we talk about winning per screen, pockets $10-15 million in limited release. But Billionaire Boys Club, a casualty of everything, continuing to ripple out from everything that happened last year.
It also just might not be very good. And you know what? As a piece of research for us and the show, I
haven't seen it. I should check it out.
I'm going to check it out.
Yeah.
So we are not a print news organization, as you guys know. We are a video news organization, and so this is how we print a retraction.
That's right. No, I got called on something last week that I myself have pointed out on this show before about tracking the global box office. It was an oversight on my part that I wanted to acknowledge, and as a matter of fact, it has encouraged me to change the show and add a new chart that we're going to look at.
We have a new chart.
We have a new chart. Last week I talked about Ant-Man and the Wasp and how it was clinging on to the number 10 spot on the worldwide charts and saying, well, Mission Impossible is going to come out in China and there's going to be a lot of other things. I neglected to realize that Ant-Man and the Wasp has not yet opened in China. It opens in China this week. So there are more box office dollars globally for Ant-Man and the Wasp still on the horizon. It also has a couple of other markets. And that was my bad. That's something that I should have noted. I lost track of it. It's been so long since it opened here. It just opened in the UK far after it opened here. But I realized I need to be more tapped in to the global market. other than just mentioning.
I think that this is going to be an exciting new chart. I also think that we are, in fact, allowed to be human. Put that aside, let's take a look at this exciting new chart, which is the global. Now, just to make it clear, when we say global box office, we're in the United States. So that is the markets outside of the United States, which is, for us, the domestic box office. When we say worldwide, that is the combination of domestic, meaning the United States in our particular case, and the global box office. Of that said, let's look at the global box office.
That's right. We look at the domestic top 5 every weekend, but I've never thought to every week look at what were the top 5 films worldwide. So we're going to start doing that every week now. So this is the kind of the difference between the worldwide market and the domestic, what we call the domestic, the North American market. This is inclusive of both. So these are the top grossers worldwide. So this is the all of the grosses in every country, including North America. Worldwide, The Meg was the top grossing film this weekend. It made $88.1 million. It has now topped $300 million worldwide. We talked last week about its budget and how well it needed to do. $300 million in 2 weeks is a pretty good start for The Meg. So it needs to keep churning through and keep earning money, but it's off to a good start to help earn that money back. Plus, as we talked about, the bigger the hit, the more you can probably sell ancillary rights, cable, TV, streaming, everything else. So that's a good start for The Meg. Number 2 was a movie that was only in China. It was a movie called The Island. It was the second highest global grosser for the weekend. This was the number 1 film last week at the Chinese box office. It made over $70 million last week. It was actually in a controversial finish with another movie called Apartment. There were some allegations that film had basically the production company had bought tickets themselves to boost the image of the film. But it was the second highest global grosser just based on the Chinese market. It's now grossed over $100 million in China, as has The Meg. The Meg has now grossed over $100 million in China, which is good news for Warner Brothers because since this is a Chinese co-financing deal, they get a bigger slice of that Chinese box office than they would have normally. Hotel Transylvania, Mission Impossible, number 3 and 4, tied up there pretty close. Mission Impossible opens in China in a couple weeks, week after next. And then Crazy Rich Asians, as we were talking about here, that's pretty much just the U.S. market. It opened in a couple of foreign markets this weekend. It hits a lot of markets, including a lot of Asian markets, including Singapore, which is where the bulk of the film is set this weekend. It's going to be in most markets worldwide by the middle of September. So we'll keep an eye on how Crazy Rich Asians looks as it rolls out beyond the domestic.
Well, I'm loving this new chart. And now we can look at the year to date in the worldwide box office.
Right. So we're not just looking at how the worldwide box office is doing yearly. We're going to start looking at it weekly. I think it's going to be fun. But yeah, let's look at the year to date. As mentioned, Ant-Man and the Wasp is at number 10. Mission Impossible Fallout jumps in at number 9. And Dying to Survive, which was number 9, drops out of the chart. How, do you ask, did Mission Impossible jump in? If Dying to Survive was above Ant-Man and the Wasp, then why is Ant-Man and the Wasp still on the list? Number 1, it's still making money. And number 2, there are always some slight fluctuations in the numbers that are gathered from the Chinese box office, largely because it is such a massive market. The number of screens to keep track of in just China alone. A lot of times you will see the numbers on films fluctuate, sometimes higher, sometimes lower, a week after the numbers are reported because there's just so much to keep track of. So those numbers fluctuated down a little bit. That ended up putting it below Ant-Man and the Wasp. So we talked about Mission Impossible being on this chart very soon. There it is. It's broken the $500 million mark with the Chinese opening still to come.
And we will see where Ant-Man and the Wasp goes from here when it does, in fact, open in China. The domestic chart to date, Fallout, making its way up, but no big changes just yet.
Yeah, no change really. It's gaining on A Quiet Place. It'll probably jump over A Quiet Place next week. It's gaining on Ant-Man. It's gaining on Solo. But for this week, everything stays put. We're at a little bit of a lull between the end of the summer and as we start getting into the fall. But yeah, nothing changed places, but there are some changes brewing, much like the summer movie report.
Yes.
No changes, but the Meg is swimming
Chomping
up behind
its way.
Mamma Mia. Abba, look out. Swim faster because
she's gonna eat ya.
The Meg is slowly but surely gaining on Mamma Mia.
Here comes the Meg.
Here comes the Meg.
Mama, you're gonna die now. Yeah, that's not a happy sound. That's likely what will happen in terms of this. And we'll see where Crazy Rich Asians lands. We still have a couple of more weeks until it's officially Labor Day happens and it is no longer the summer.
Yeah.
So we will see what happens overall this weekend. Happy Time Murders opens. The puppets, the raunchy puppet hard R movie. You never know.
You never know. That could be the surprise hit of the summer. Stranger things have happened.
That's true. We will be back next week to talk about that and all of the box office things. We hope you like the new chart this week. Let us know what you think in the comments below, and we will see you next Monday.